Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast, hosted by longtime Northwest sports journalist Dan Viens. News, reaction, and opinion. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's the Seahawks Forever podcast. I'm Dan. Coming up on today's show, Griffin Sturgeon of the Seattle Overload podcast will join me again. We're going to talk about how well the Seahawks' new linemen fit what they want and need to do on both sides of the ball this year. We're going to actually talk some offense as well. And we're going to dive into the question of just which scheme are the Seahawks running on defense after all. Hopefully we'll get to dissect that once and for all. But first, if you like the content you're getting from the show, please like the video and subscribe to the channel at the YouTube icon that you see over there in the corner. Coming up on 1,000 subscriptions, and that's a big goal, so I appreciate your support there. Before I bring Griffin in, a couple of newsy things to get to today. First, today was the first of 9 voluntary minicamp workouts with the full squad. Now, we had the rookie minicamp last week. They joined the veterans today. Couple of items: Jamal Adams, Jordan Brooks, not present as expected. They were both in Texas continuing to rehab from their injuries. Interestingly enough, though, Brian Monet was on hand, not taking part in drills, coming off the ACL injury. There's some question about how severe that injury was, but I don't know. I consider that good news that he was on hand for workouts today. A couple of surprising absences that we don't have details on yet. Newly signed defensive end Mario Edwards and rookie sensation Tariq Woolen were not on the field. No reports as to why. Remember, this is voluntary, this minicamp. Pete Carroll did not speak to the media today, so we did not get any more details on that. And a couple of new signings to report. Interestingly enough, cornerback Artie Burns is back. The former Steelers first-round pick was on the Seahawks roster all last year, but played in only 16 snaps. Just camp depth there, I would imagine. He's familiar with the scheme. Probably just a veteran presence there for the young guys. And the team added yet another young defensive lineman today. Former Tennessee defensive tackle Latrell Bumpus was on hand. The 6'3", 290-pounder, described as a nose tackle, played in 55 games over his career for the Volunteers. Some other big news. Bobby Wagner says he's gotten a look at the team's new throwback uniform set to debut this year and officially describes them as fire. And one other thing. I found this interesting, and I'll dive into this on a later show. The NFL today approved a rule allowing each team to have a third emergency quarterback available on game days. Interesting the way they structured this rule. Again, I will address that coming up on a show in the near future. But today, we're going to talk some scheme fits, and we're going to talk some rookie linemen with Griffin Sturgeon. Welcome back to the show, Griffin. How you doing, man?
Good. Thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
Always. It's been a tumultuous, adventurous month with the draft. You and I spoke before the draft. We talked about some guys you thought would fit. I think we even talked about Mike Morris at one point, or I may have asked your thoughts on him. But first I want to start kind of with the big picture, and then we'll narrow in from there and talk some more specifics.
Sure.
I wanted to hit this piece of audio. Clint Hurt was on Seattle Sports 710 with Michael Bumpus and Stacey Ross last week. And he was asked specifically, the big question last offseason, well, the big news last offseason was Seahawks were changing from a 4-3 to a 3-4 on defense. And obviously the results were mixed last year. Some real struggles at times, especially on run defense, although the coverage was pretty solid for the most part. And then the news or the storyline this offseason seems more to be, what the hell are they going to run? Is it a 3-4? Is it a 4-3? Is it a hybrid? Pete Carroll said some things. They've sort of backed off some of those statements. This is what Clint Hurt had to say on the subject recently.
Is the plan to have a 3-4 again this year?
Really a 3-4, 4-3.
I know it's more complicated than that.
It's really one and the same.
Yeah.
If I say you're a 4-3 team and you play a lot of underfront,
Yeah.
well, guess what? That's what we're in like 95% of the time.
Yeah.
So that's why I always look like, really, it's more. It's being made to be more than what it is.
Is it being made to be more than what it is, or are they backing off some of those changes and reverting more to what they used to do? What's going on here?
So much of it is is semantics, right? But I think it's hard to where to start with this conversation, because the way I see it is that they made this switch to 3-4 in 2020, 3 years ago. And Pete Carroll also mentioned, I think on 710, he said to Brock and Mike Salk, he said we started to live in this bear world that Brock Heward brought up 3 years ago. He said, now he didn't bring with that any like numbers, he didn't get specific with it, but I think some of it is that like bear can be run in a 4-3 personnel or 3-4 personnel, or it can be ran out of a 4-3 look or 3-4 look. But most of the time it's 3-4. And when we talk 3-4 in the modern NFL right now, we're really talking about bear fronts where you've got 2-3 techniques and then a 0 technique nose tackle flanked by 2 outside linebackers. So, but in 2020, when you have Carlos Dunlap, even though he's technically standing up, I think, he's 6'6", 290. You just kind of think 4-3, right? But so from the sideline angle, if you take their, and this kind of gets into what Clint is saying, if you take their classic 4-3 under or 4-3 over fronts, they've got 5 guys on the line of scrimmage, right? Mm-hmm. So if you take that front, especially if you're just looking from the sideline, if you simply have the Leo stand up and kick the 1 technique in to a 0 technique, you have a 3-4 bear or a 3-4 tight front or a combination. So I think, and as we know, the classic Pete quote is, this goes back decades, right? Like I run a 4-3 with 3-4 personnel and or 3-4 principles. It's because what they were doing is already, there's so much overlap and similarity that the switch kind of went under the radar in 2020 because fundamentally, like what Clint is saying, it's really not that big of a deal. It's their principles were already so crosswired with the 3-4 to begin with. It's just when you go into pure bear space where you kick that 1 technique into a 2-gapping nose tackle, you're just kind of leaning further into it. But I think the commentary there is that Pete Carroll's always embraced what the 3-4 can do for you up front. And really that principle is you want 300 pounders in the B gaps, and you don't want them to be able to make it easy on them. You want to dictate what their run menu can be basically to the offense. So I think that's kind of I think that's why there's so much like, well, they promoted Clint Hurt. He's from the Fangio defense. He said 3-4. So now we're kind of this 3-4 world, but really just speaking to their base defense, like when they're in base personnel with four defensive backs, it's kind of when they're in base personnel, they're still a 3-4 team. Like there's very little difference between what they did under Clint Hurt in base personnel this past year than they did the 2 previous seasons of Ken Norton Jr. Where things got different last year was within their nickel package. And I think that's really where we can pinpoint and identify not only what was indeed different, but also what went wrong. So a 3-4 team, any 3-4 team is going to have 2 main nickel packages. They're going to have the nickel version of the 3-4, the 3-3-5. And then where you still have 3 big interior bodies on the line of scrimmage. And then you drop one of your off ball linebackers for a nickel back while still keeping your 2 big outside linebackers on the line of scrimmage. Right. Mm-hmm. And then you have whether the 2-4-5 or the 4-2-5, which really looks and operates like the nickel version of a 4-3. So it looks like, like a 4-2-5 is just a 4-3, but you're swapping your Sam for your nickel, right? Okay. And then the 2-4-5 is really the same thing. You're calling the 2 edges outside linebackers, even if they're standing up, they're functioning like a defensive end. They don't drop, they're rushing, right? So what happened last year with Clint Hurt is that he took their nickel snaps and they cut their 3-3-5 in half. And then they replaced those snaps with the 2-4-5. And that was all to kind of embrace the idea of we're going to be aggressive. We're not going to drop our edges as much. Because remember, that was the big complaint, right? Yeah. Ironically, that complaint came, you can only drop your edges if you're running a 3-4. Like that's like the subtext behind the complaints behind Ken Norton Jr. is that they're running a 3-4. So Clint Hurt is saying, all right, we're going to do less of that. When it's time to rush the passer, we want our edges. We want them to get going upfield. And that's great when they present 11 personnel, 1st and 10 shotgun or 2nd and 5, whatever. That's great because you're saying we have two deep safeties. We're going to defend the sidelines. We're going to defend deep, and we're going to be able to rush the passer with 4, so that our second level isn't having to cover forever. They can rally to the check down because that was their problem under Ken Norton Jr. They defended the second level really well, the third level really well, but they could not tackle the running back because they were too distanced from him, like geometrically. So they needed a pass rush. So they said, all right, we can't rush the passer in 3-3-5, so we need to use the 2-4-5. But then the problem is, so yeah, there were clear benefits in their pass defense improved in nickel even more with the 2-4-5. They became a little bit more of a three-dimensional pass defense, but then the run defense within that sample regressed enough to bring down the entire picture. So it's a little bit like you're playing whack-a-mole. So really this year, I don't think anything like fundamentally like, so going from Ken Norton Jr. to Clint Hurt, they didn't really do anything. They didn't work out of a different playbook so much as they spent more and less time within the packages that were already in the playbook. So it's really, how do we apply what we already have differently? And philosophically, Clint Hurt was, I want to be aggressive up front. And there are trade-offs. So I think, we'll get into the players, right? But I think his task is, as a coordinator, is how do I balance this? How do I still stay balanced against the run? Does that mean on 2nd and 4, I trot out the 2-4-5, or do I trot out the 3-3-5 if they're in 11? Do I save the 2-4-5 for 2nd and long, 3rd and long? 1st and 10, do I still defend the run? And then you just play that balancing act throughout the season.
Is that kind of what Carroll was talking about too? Because he had a comment last week or the week before about how the problems against the run, I thought this was an interesting comment. He said the problems against the run weren't necessarily with what was happening up front. It was changes we were making in how we cover. Did you catch those comments from him?
Yeah. So there is another piece to this, because I mean, I'd have to really go back and look at how they tried to defend the run out of their what was a 4-2-5 under Ken Norton Jr. to see how they coached the linebackers. And the second level fitters, because one of the safeties is a primary run defender. Like, he's not just like a rally and help guy. Like, he actually has, like, you have a gap. So I'd have to go back and like compare and contrast how they did it. But it's when you spend that much time in the 2-4-5 world, and I think it can't be underemphasized how many snaps they spend in this, in situations where the offense will still run the ball. Like, if an offense isn't under center, if they're in 11 personnel but they're still under center, they're still running the ball 2/3 of the time on 1st and 10, even if they're in 11. So they're basically saying, well, if we go into 11, they're going to match with this, but then if we go into under center and run it, we'll get 5.5 yards per carry, which is what they did.
Yeah.
So like 5.5, if you can generate 5.5 yards per carry, you're going to keep doing that, because that's actually efficient. If you don't defend the run like it matters, then it will if you defend the run like it doesn't matter, statistically, it will start to matter. That's like the league-wide numbers reflect a league that is still defending the run. If you defend the run on 1st and 10 like it's 3rd and long, then the numbers will, start to add up. So it's I think, like, regardless of what Pete says and what the coaching staff says, like, yeah, the coaching could have been better, the players could have performed better. But the way I see it is, if you look at their numbers in each respective front, which Sports Info Solutions kind of affords that ability to do that, you can like isolate like what their performance is with how many guys in the box, etc. If you just rattled off like fronts A, B, C, and D and looked at their numbers in 2021, when collectively they had a top 10 run defense, and look at their numbers in 2022, collectively bottom 5, their numbers in each front are pretty much the same. The only difference is they're spending more time in the fronts they don't defend the run in more, or well. So to me, I don't see it as, are they really performing below what should be expected, as so much as are they just using aspects of their defense suboptimally. It's like taking a hitter in baseball who has certain numbers against lefties and certain numbers against righties, and then you only play him against the type of pitcher that he does poorly against, and it's like, well, did he intrinsically regress, or is it contextual? So I think that's kind of where they go with it. If they were to scheme identically to how they did last year with the players they have now, I think they would get even worse front to front. However, if they scheme like they did in 2021, I think their numbers collectively can be better than they were in 2022. So personally, I really feel like scheme was doing the heavy lifting in 2021 and vice versa, or on the flip side, doing the opposite in 2022. That's kind of how I view it. But, they still had decisions they had to make at D-line. They had to get cheaper, younger. They had to pay for Draymond Jones. So, like, there's a bigger picture at play here. But yeah, it's ultimately, it's hard to nail down exactly what Pete means unless you can back him to a corner and like have him really hash it out. But beyond that, it's kind of how I see it.
It's funny, just about a second before you brought up the baseball analogy, that's where my head went to. I was thinking about pitcher versus hitter and how sometimes you just play those numbers wrong. So let's talk about this then. As we get into the discussion of personnel, and you talk about how they went out and paid Dre Jones, something they haven't done before, really going out in the free agent market and paying significant money for a top dollar, top tier, young, in his prime free agent. With all the talk about how they struggled on run defense last year and how that needs to be fixed, they go out and spend money on a guy who's primarily known for getting to the passer. But you're on record as saying, and I think we might have talked about this the last time you were on the show, that your belief is, the common conception of last year is bad scheme fit for the players that we had. Puna was playing out of position. Shelby wasn't the perfect fit. So they flushed all those guys out and started completely fresh. You're on record, though, as saying you didn't necessarily agree with that. And you thought it was more scheme and call based. So and maybe I'm asking you to repeat what you just talked about a little bit, but
Sure.
why do you think they felt the need to completely start fresh and get rid of all those guys?
I think part of it might have been the relationship with Puna, because he was an unrestricted free agent. That might have soured. Like you can on a case by case basis.
Do you think Puna would have fit?
I think in the 3-4 and the 3-3-5, he was a fit, because in my view, like that's what they're doing in 2020, 2021. Nobody thought Puna 4 was a bad run defender those years.
Yeah.
If you isolate his play in the 3-4, which was more sparse this year, I thought his play looked just as it did the previous 2 seasons. But when they go in the 2-4-5, that's where Puna, in contrast to Shelby and Al and everyone else, where again, it was still hard on them. I do agree that he did worse than them in those contexts, because even though he's like squatty and leverage oriented, he's a really dense 300 pounds. Like 300 pounds just isn't enough mass to take on the doubles in a 4-man front as opposed to a 5-man front. They stay on you longer, especially when you have a two deep safeties as opposed to one. Like this, that's even if they're that extra guy in the box, even if he himself isn't necessarily a good player, just for the sake of discussion, his presence changes the math for the offensive line, and it just makes it easier. Like you're dispersing responsibility essentially when there's more guys in the box. So I thought they were all scheme fits for their base defense. But on a case by case basis, like Shelby Harris had a $9 million cap hit. You save $6 million. I get it. You cut him, you save 6. Puna Ford probably wasn't going to sign back here for what he signed in Buffalo. Like Pete said multiple times in like his non-normal Pete speak, like, oh, we love the guy. Like he really wanted him back. Like at Seattle probably valued him, I would guess, between $3 and $5 million. And Puna said, I'd only sign for that somewhere else. Maybe. Al Woods is the only, Al Woods is the only true head scratcher to me, because like, he to me, like, I think he was the only guy that everyone seemed on the same page with, like, okay, yeah, he fits and he's good. But if you were to create an argument against him, he's 36 years old. His Achilles was bothering toward the end of the season. But then my counter is, well, you saved $3 million by cutting him, and then Jaron Reed cost $3 million. And just in watching Jaron Reed in Green Bay, I didn't think he was that good in all contexts. Not like, oh, not just in the 2-4-5, but in 3-4, he's good. Like in any front the Green Bay ran, he didn't seem to do well. But you can still fashion an argument for Jaron Reed. They have history. They'll reduce his snaps. They think they can rehone his technique, et cetera. We can get him back to who he was. He's only 30. It's not like he's 32, like all that can matter. Right. So I can see it. But to me, it's just straight up, Al Woods is a good player. So you cut a player and you maybe didn't use the cap savings that efficiently. Quentin Jefferson makes sense, probably just from a cap hit angle. I mean, he actually did have a good pressure rate. I thought he was okay in Bear, the 3-4 stuff. Like, I'm not going to say he was actually good. Like I thought Puna and Shelby and Al were. I think he was just merely okay. But then the 2-4-5, he was definitely a weak point. So I get it. And then on top of that, he and Draymond are kind of a similar skill set, and Draymond's just simply an upgrade. So, that's kind of how I see them making those decisions one by one. And I think overall they're saying, even if, let's say they did like those players as much as, say, like me, an armchair analyst appreciates them. So even if they did, they're saying, okay, Draymond Jones though is a star. Like he can be a Pro Bowler.
Yeah.
And with Al and Puna and Shelby, those guys are maybe average, mildly above average, but we've been getting veteran defensive tackles every year for relatively cheap. I mean, Al Woods is one of those guys originally, right?
Yep.
Relatively cheap, and we can get a threshold of play out of them on a cheaper cap hit. So it's them having, signed Nwosu 2 years ago and now signing or last year rather, and now signing Draymond Jones and saying we can backfill in with the rotational players and we can kind of front load the talent a little bit more, because that's something that's been missing on the front, right? So maybe they're just kind of recalibrating their general rostering approach.
So now that you've had a chance after the draft to absorb what they did and take a closer look at especially the two guys that are going to play on the interior defensive line, let's start with Cameron Young, the 4th rounder. Reports that he's up to 319, 320 now already after reporting at 305, 304 at the combine. What are your thoughts on him and specifically how he fits what they need right now?
I mean, yeah, I think he's a fine pick. Like he's a day 3 pick, right? He's kind of like Tony McDaniel, Otaba Rubin caliber of player, in that you're getting, serviceable early down snaps. He'll eat up 300 to 400 to 500 snaps as he goes from year 1 to year 2 to year 3, He kind of gives them what they need. I don't think he's amazing or anything, but he's going to be reliable and serviceable. The only question, I have is that, he's a rookie and you just don't necessarily know what you're getting into with rookies. We talked last time, like Jordan Davis is one of the best nose tackle prospects to come out in forever. And he was merely okay his first year in Philly. Yeah. So, and he's going to be good, like year 2, like he's going to explode probably this year. But it's just, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. And like the turnover at defensive line they do every year, it's just so rare to get rid of literally everybody except Miles Adams, so like they literally had 6 guys getting snaps, and now all of them are gone except for Miles Adams and Brian Monet, who you mentioned. We have no idea what his health status is. If Monet was good to go, I probably wouldn't be sweating, because between him, Draymond, and Jaren, they kind of have a floor, I think. And then the rookies can just be rookies. You don't have to be like, it all hinges on you and an undrafted free agent to play nose tackle for us. But that said, if you're going to draft a nose tackle in the 4th round, Cam Young is, a totally fine pick. So,
yeah, it really makes me wonder about Monet and that maybe he's in better shape as far as his timeline coming back off that ACL than some of us thought, because it does seem odd, especially given the fact that this organization thinks that they're in a contention window right now and that they can challenge in the NFC West, to trust and to really put a rookie out there in a position that's so glaringly a position of need and really count on him. I mean, he has to play.
Right.
Yeah.
And
it's
go ahead.
No, you finish your thought.
Well, I was just going to say, like, Brian Monet gave them really good play, but it wasn't until his 2nd year, right? Like his first year, he was kind of a mess, in my opinion. Puna Ford didn't really get snaps till his 2nd year. So it's just, rookie years can be anything, especially as you go further down the draft, So,
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point you make about Jordan Davis. I think, and maybe this will be another show I'll do. If you go back over the last 10 years and you look at highly drafted interior defensive linemen, big names, guys taken in the top 10, a lot of them take a while to find their footing. What do you think? Is it purely the fact that they're just not mature enough physically to go up against NFL offensive linemen? Is that it? When you're throwing these guys out there at 21, 22 years old?
Yeah, I'm sure that's part of it. Like there's the physical adjustment period. And then also you're playing more snaps than you probably did in college. Yeah. Because you have like Charles Cross, Abraham Lucas, their line of scrimmage players on the other side. Like they literally fell off a cliff this past season. They had a great rookie year, but they fell off a cliff as soon as they exceeded the amount of games they played in college. It was like week 13 when they kind of like their play was all over. They had a couple bounce back games in there, but they kind of fell off. Right. So there's that, but then also I think that part of it is the processing speed. Like the average guard and center is so much faster and quicker. And so many defensive tackles, like I don't know how they do it, because as I've tried to learn more about how they play and stuff, so much of it is processing and reading blocking schemes and letting like little tiny tells inform them how to play to make them look like they're playing faster than they really are. And I think that's the other side of it. They have to adjust to a different game pretty much. You can't just manhandle guys. You have to, be able to anticipate and read your keys to allow you to know what to do. And I think that's probably part of it. Because you'll get guys that look less athletic, and it's like, are they really less athletic fundamentally, or are they just reacting at a lesser rate because there's just different things happening on the field. And that probably goes for all positions, right? But it's sink or swim in the line of scrimmage, like immediately, right? When you come into the league. So I think that's part of it. So the main thing is they'll probably have to see how few snaps can we get away with playing each of him. And I think the other guy is probably Robert Cooper. That factors in the undrafted free agent. But yeah, we'll see. I think ultimately Cam Young will be able to handle it just fine. But yeah.
They're certainly throwing a bunch of bodies at it. Coming out of the draft, he was the only nose tackle on the roster outside of Monet, and now there's 7 guys that are listed at nose tackle. They've added from just about everywhere: college, undrafted free agency, and even the XFL. Let's talk about Mike Morris, because he's a much different animal, much longer player, 6'6", up to 290 at last check. I think they want him to get closer to 300. It sounds like, and a guy that Pete keeps talking about how he's going to play inside. And I think some fans have taken that to mean nose tackle. But again, in those 3-4 principles, inside can mean any of those, defensive end or nose tackle, right? The 3 guys. I think they're just trying to make that delineation that he played edge. He played outside linebacker, essentially a stand-up position at Michigan. He's not going to be doing that with the Seahawks. What have you seen? And again, I know he's a guy you're familiar with because we talked about him a month ago. What have you seen from him that well, I was going to say leads you to believe that he'll be a fit, but how do you like his fit right now?
Well, so initially watching him at Michigan, I kind of assumed that he was kind of in that tweener weight bracket. Like, he doesn't really fit them. Maybe he does. If he gains weight, drops weight, whatever. But as an edge rusher, I liked him a lot. Like, if he was actually the 6'6", 290 he was listed at, the way he moved on the edge, like, I know his combine wasn't great, but if you just talk like movement skill stuff, you just have to see, it's really impressive. So then then he had a few snaps where he kind of played interior a little bit, and he didn't look great. And then we found out later he played at 280. So, and then they drafted him. They said, we're going to move him inside. So they said, okay, we want him back up to 295. And in my mind, I'm thinking this is cool because he's got movement skills, and, they're no stranger to taking outside rushers and putting them inside and letting them wreak havoc, like the bigger guys, the tweener guys. They find homes for tweeners, right? So I was really intrigued by it, but I assume, okay, this is a projection. And then sure enough, I go back and then also there, I think Matt Berry, the director of pro personnel, said that he played defensive tackle the year prior. So it's like, oh, okay. So he's not a total stranger to it. I assume this was like a total, like they're making a projection based off of this and that and putting together an argument for themselves. So going back and watching, I watched a few of his 2021 games where he's playing like a 3 technique in bear or a 4-eye in what they call tight, which is kind of like the same thing really. And he's 2 gapping and 1 gapping. And he actually, in one-on-ones, he actually looks the part. Like, he comes out low. His hands are in the right spot. His footwork is like really mechanical, like in a good way. Like, he commits to the technique, and his pad level isn't an issue on one-on-one blocking. When he gets doubles, when guys kind of combo him, he'll tend to get uprooted a little bit, but it's not in ways that, that isn't uncommon among 6'6" guys, just because 1, that's where the pad level can become an issue. And then 2, you're presenting so much surface area to the guy, the second blocker, that there's just so much to latch onto and move. So yeah, he will get moved, but I think back to Draymond Jones at OSU. He was 275, 280 at OSU, and he got rocked off the line of scrimmage a lot. He put on weight in college or in Denver. Sure enough, he played for a 3-4 base team. And in one-on-ones, he's a good run defender, I'd say. He'll every once in a while, a combo will blow him off the line of scrimmage, but it doesn't have to be that big of a deal if everyone else has their act together. In 2020, LJ Collier, I think, was playing average run defense. Then he fell off, but he kind of got up to a level where it's like he can handle one-on-ones. Occasionally, he'd get rocked by a double or a combo, but their collective run defense was still fine. So I guess I'm saying if LJ can do it, Mike probably can, because I think he's a better prospect coming out. Draymond Jones is an excellent player, and he started off in a worse place than Morris as an interior run defender. Obviously, as a pass rusher coming out of OSU, Draymond was really exciting. But then on that pass rush note, like Mike Morris, oddly enough, he doesn't really have any moves as an interior pass rusher, whereas he does on the outside, which is odd to me. But on the inside, like he's got a bull rush, and then he's just got pure speed too. So, I mean, he's a factor. And clearly they see like there's a potential for a legit interior pass rusher here. And if we can just get his run defense up to a serviceable level, that means you can enjoy the benefits of that pass rush on early downs and not just third and long. Because that's when Michigan mostly used him. But if you squint, you can find those early down snaps with him, and he stands up and he plays really sound technique. And I'm sure that's probably what Clint Hurt, what that jumped out to him, because it's not just, okay, physically he can hold up, even though he's kind of a mess. He actually plays the position. He knows what he's doing. So he's like, we'll just get him back up to 295. On that note, though, sorry, I know this is long-winded. This past year, when he did play inside, which was rare, but when he did not look good. And I think that's just because John Schneider mentioned, and he himself mentioned, he played at 280. And I think that for his height is just the threshold of being too light for his body type. So 295, what he played it in his junior year, I think is a sweet spot for him, because he can still move and affect the passer at that weight as well.
I think it's going to be one of the most interesting things for me personally is to see what he looks like when the preseason comes around. It's fascinating to me that we forget about the concept of development and projection, and that guys look different and they grow and they, not just get better technique wise, but physically. Somebody posted on Twitter the other day, and I thought I bookmarked it. I tried to find it again. Thought I screenshotted it. Couldn't find it anywhere. But Al Woods has been playing at around the 330 level for the last few years, for most of his career in the NFL, correct?
Mm-hmm.
You remember what he weighed coming out of college, coming out of LSU?
No, was it like 300 or something?
On his draft profile, he was 309.
There you go.
Al Woods was 309 pounds. And, Cam Young's already up to 319, and we're already putting weight on Mike Morris. It's going to be interesting to see the trajectory those guys take. One other change to that group, since you and I talked, is we knew they had, after the draft, they had to add more veterans. There was a lot of talk that maybe Shelby Harris would come back once Woods and Ford officially signed elsewhere. Mario Edwards was the guy. And Pete has talked in pretty glowing terms about the impact they think he's going to make on this team. Never been a flashy player, never more than 4 sacks in a season, but really, except for one injury-marred season his second year in the league, never less than 2, very consistent performer. Started 7 games for Tennessee last year. Your thoughts on how he fits in?
I like it a lot. So last year with Tennessee, he actually played like actual defensive end, like in a 4-down front, even if like their spacing is weird. Like he's effectively playing like 5 technique, outside shoulder of the tackle. So he's an edge. And he was a really good run defender. I mean, he's whatever he is, 280, 285. I mean, like he was like tackles couldn't move him. But then if you go the year prior when he played in Chicago, when Sean Desai was the defensive coordinator, who of course was there on staff with Vic Fangio, he was an interior player, and he wasn't a high snap player, but he was, in my opinion, he was good. Like he and Eddie Goldman, like when they were all healthy, they were defending the run well, along with Akeem Hicks. So he's kind of like Draymond Jones in that he's like that. He's just on the cusp weight wise, but he holds up inside fine. He can 1 gap, he can 2 gap. The only question I have on that note is he feels like a Draymond mirror, and like Draymond Jones is on the light side for a defensive interior player, whether a 3-4 ender or a defensive tackle in a 4-3, which, 3 tech 4, it's kind of, you put it all in the same bucket. I don't know about them being on the field together at the same time that often. Just because I feel like you want your poundage to be a little bit higher than that. Like in a perfect world, one of the ends is a 310, 315 guy, the nose is 330, and then the other guy can be Draymond if that's his skill set. But I mean, he's still a sound enough player that doesn't have to be that big of a deal. And throughout his career, I don't think he's really exceeded 500 snaps that often. So I think the what seems like is being what is being like hinted at is that he and Jaron Reed are just going to be, vibing in and out of the lineup, having a vet on the first string and second string, whoever starts, whoever doesn't, will kind of raise the floor. And then Draymond will probably be a 750 snap player. So he'll be able to help the second string out as well. So they'll be able to mix and match it. So ultimately, I'm not too worried about all that. I think he's a good player though. But what is unique about him is that because he's 285 and because he can play an actual like 4-3 defensive end-esque player, that means when they go into 2-4-5, he can still give you some edge rush. Like he has an actual potent bull rush. So he can raise your floor and run defense when you want to go 2-4-5, but still have a width for your pass rush so you can get after the passer still. And you can kind of do that with Draymond too. I don't think Draymond gives you a lot of edge rush. He gives you kind of like an inside move every once in a while. But this helps raise their floor and base. And then it also gives them a lot of versatility in nickel, so they can kind of weave in and out of stuff. And I think that's kind of maybe what Pete was hinting at. He can give you interior pass rush, outside rush, then you can kind of use them all over the place, kind of like Michael Bennett. Not to the same level, of course, but he really helps them out. So I'm intrigued by that move. Between him, Draymond, and Mike Morris, they've got 3 of those guys that can really weave in and out a little bit. So I'm curious to see how they use them.
Let me ask you this. So just about every player we talk about in that group, there's question marks about, either because they're young and we just don't know what they're going to give us, or because they're coming off a bad year like Jaron Reed. And you were the first to show clips of him in Green Bay last year, and they weren't pretty. And then Mario Edwards, a guy who's been a journeyman basically since being a second-round pick with the Raiders 7 years ago. And then you have Draymond Jones, who you just said earlier in the show can be a star and a Pro Bowler. But injuries happen in football, and the chances of being able to count on a certain group or even a certain player for 16 games, not likely. Is this group overly dependent on him staying healthy?
I think so, in the same way that the edge rush was overly dependent on Nwosu last year, and thankfully he stayed healthy. I don't think wear and tear will be a problem for Draymond, because he played like 500 snaps, and then last year they turned him into a full-time player, 800 snaps, and his efficiency didn't drop. And he didn't suffer like an acute injury at any point. I don't think he played the whole season. So, barring just like a freak accident, right? I think he'll be able to hold up from that angle. But it definitely feels like they're a little front loaded in talent. But what's fun about it is the guys that aren't meant to be stars right now, there you can see room for actual like upwards mobility. Like Mike Morris technically could be anything.
Yeah.
Whereas Cam Young, we know what Cam Young is. He's going to be like a honorable early down run stuffer, do your job, and he's going to wear that badge. It's going to be great. It's going to be right, but he's not going to ever he's not going to be one of those guys that turns into Fletcher Cox, right? But Mike Morris might be another Draymond Jones. Like, that's possible. That doesn't mean it's the likeliest scenario, but it's a possibility, right? So that's kind of how I see that. Yeah.
Before I let you go, I want to talk offense a little bit, because the only time that you and I have ever gotten together, we've only talked defense. And I do want to get your thoughts on Olu Oluwatimi and Anthony Bradford on the offensive side. Guys that, when they were drafted or even leading up to the draft, doing mocks and things like that, some people would come at me and say they're not mobile enough. They don't fit the outside zone. They're a little bit more bigger physical players than we're used to at that spot. I actually appreciate that about it, because I think we needed to get more physical at that spot. I think late in the year last year, some of the issues Geno had with interior pressure were because Austin Blythe and Gabe Jackson were just, teams were picking on those guys. How do you feel about those two and their upside?
I think I like both. I think they're both eventual starters in the NFL. For Oluwatimi, I think he's, of all the centers, I think he's might be the most balanced center that came out. As in, he checks the most boxes, maybe not any given box, the best, like that's probably John Michael Schmitz or Tittman. But I think he's a balanced center. He can run block. I think he actually can handle some of the outside zone stuff. But yeah, when you go into shotgun, where you don't have the ability, when you run inside zone shotgun, you don't have like the runway. Like, you have to move bodies immediately, because the running back's path is like hitting immediately up the gut, right? You don't get the running back doesn't have the time to stretch it out and then cut, right? So you need to move guys immediately. And I think he, especially when he's in tandem with the guard, he can really move bodies. And what's cool watching him is when he comes across a guy that he can't move, and he knows he can't move them, how he used the angle game to at least take them out of the play a little bit. When they played Illinois, because the Illinois played, and I was watching them because one for Devin Witherspoon, right? But they also, there was Calvin Avery that the Seahawks had visited with, and they didn't end up taking him in undrafted free agency, or they weren't able to. I mean, he was a decent nose tackle. I mean, kind of like Robert Cooper, kind of like Cam Young. Like, yeah, he fits the part. So they played a 5-man front. And the reason why I wanted to watch that game was, first of all, 5-man front, so there are more one-on-ones. A lot of centers don't really block well one-on-ones. Even centers we consider to be good centers, they bring their value in their communication and how they handle angles and doubles and combos and all that. So I wanted to see how he did in actual one-on-one. And yeah, he gets his butt kicked by the 350-pounder a couple of times, but then there's some times where he actually moves the guy. And then there are some times where they kind of stalemate, and then he kind of wins at the last second and leverages it so where he can't work and cross face into the other gap to give his guards some help, to give his running back some help. So you kind of see that, like, okay, he's not going to be Jason Kelsey, but he's not going to be Max Unger as a run blocker, but he can be something below that and still be maybe a top 10 center in the league. Pass protection, though, I mean, this guy, he doesn't cede ground. And again, in those one-on-ones, a lot of centers, they get like face-up contact and they're on an island and they get snatched a lot. Like they're being bull rushed by a huge, like almost any nose tackle can do it to them, even if they're not explosive. They get their hands on them and then they just snatch them down to the side. He knows that's coming. Like he knows how to pass set, and they try to get under him, and he's able to reshape and reestablish leverage. The couple of times where Calvin Avery tried to do it to him, he failed. So like he literally tried to snatch him, he brought him down, and then Olu Oluwatimi gets even lower and reestablishes his base and still stays square to the line of scrimmage. So as a one-on-one pass protector, I think most nose tackles he'll handle. And then when it comes to like when he's kind of setting to he's part of the slide, so like a 3-man slide where all three go one direction, he never loses like levels with his guard. Like he's always even with the guard. And then if he never like turns his shoulders, he's able to keep his shoulders square, so there's a really firm pocket. He just knows what he's doing. And Michigan rarely had any free blockers or free rushers up the middle, so he's setting the protection right. I think the camp battle with him and Evan Brown will be really exciting, because Evan Brown was a good center for Detroit. And I think Oluwatimi probably could have been drafted in the 3rd round if they wanted to, maybe late 2nd. In hindsight, watching more of him, I had him. I mean, and that's ended up what happened, right? Whippler for OSU dropped, and I was surprised by that.
Yeah.
I went back and watched more of Oluwatimi. I'm like, okay, yeah, I see why now. He's better. They got the better player. So I mean, I think that's a really cool pick. And then
you can see it. You touched on this, but one of the things that stands out to me with him in pass protection is you can see his wrestling background, and that he actually applies it, and that when he knows he's up against a more physical guy and he's beat physically, whereas Austin Blythe would get knocked backwards, like literally on his butt, and we've seen that from Seattle centers too often over the last 10 years.
Sure,
you can see that moment with Oluwatimi where he knows it, and he has this way of just shooting his base out behind himself and immediately getting into an advantageous leverage position where he's leaning into the player, and it just buys that extra split second in the pocket. He's a very, very heady player.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's going to be, to me, the most fun camp battle of all the positions on the roster is, can Evan Brown hold him off?
Agreed.
Yeah,
I agree.
And then Bradford seems to be a guy that, and maybe me included, that has sort of snuck up as a lot of people's favorite pick out of this whole draft.
Yeah, I think he's going to be a future starting guard at one point. I kind of like what they're doing along the interior right now. It's reminiscent of what Green Bay does. Like all their starters, for the most part, especially on the inside, were like third, fourth, fifth round draft picks.
Yeah,
and then they end up starting in their 2nd or 3rd year, and they become their guard of the future. And then they do it again when that guy leaves in free agency. Then it's the next guy. I feel like that's what's going on here. I think Phil Haynes probably locks it down for this year, and then Bradford, year 2, he'll be ready to go. But maybe he is good enough to warrant starting, because to me, I mean, I put him on the same level as Damian Lewis coming out of LSU, who Lewis was ready to start year 1. He wasn't a perfect player year 1, but you immediately saw the talent translate. With Lewis. I think the same thing could happen with Bradford. Like he's explosive, he's strong. I think he has decent feet, not great feet, kind of like Lewis. Like he's not quick-footed per se, but he's so squatty and explosive. He can reset his feet well. He's hard to bull rush in pass protection, and he doesn't give up the outside corner very often. When he does, from what I saw, it seemed to be like a technical error and less like he just can't handle the speed. Like some guys play with good technique and they get beat anyway because they're just outmatched, and that's really common with college guards because that's the athleticism can be all over the place with them. He doesn't get beat because he doesn't have the traits. He gets beat because he's not being consistent with his technique, and that can happen in the SEC against SEC defensive tackles. So, and then, yeah, like the run blocking, like the combine shows up with his run blocking. He's explosive. Like every once in a while, like he will move a guy, like lift them.
Yeah.
But I really liked him in pass protection because you see the tackle background. Like he almost sets like he's setting like a tackle would. He's really consistent. And he doesn't panic. Like he doesn't go too fast against a guy that he knows is faster than him. He just trusts his set, trusts his technique, and usually that takes care of it.
It's exciting that they actually made a commitment to the trenches in this draft. We haven't seen that prior to last year. Now we've got back-to-back years, and it feels like we were crying out as a fan base for them to make that commitment for years, and now they finally have, and it's kind of fun to watch. As much as we love the skill position guys and what they can do with the ball in their hands, I think this is going to be the biggest storyline as we head through OTAs and into camp, is what the trenches look like, especially how these young guys contribute to it. Thanks as always for your input. Always learn something when you're on here, and I know the feedback from the viewers is always that they do as well. So probably not going to see this all come together on the field now until late July, early August. But once it does, we'll get you on here again and get your thoughts on how it's all coming together.
All right, thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.
All right, and you can find Griffin Sturgeon on wherever you get your podcast, on the Seattle Overload podcast with Maddie Brown. If you love X's and O's, man, that's the place to go. Listen to it there, and also follow him on Twitter at CMike's Spin Move. Griffin, we'll talk to you next time, man.
All right, peace.
That's going to do it for me. Thanks again for listening to the Seahawks Forever podcast. Again, if you like what we do here, hit the like button on this video and subscribe. Would love to get to 1,000 subscriptions and go from there. And as always, love your feedback. Love the comments that I get. Give me your thoughts. What did you agree with? What did you like or not like about this episode? Your 2 cents. What do you like about this class and how you think they fit? Do you agree with what you heard today? Do you disagree? Let's get that discussion going in the comments. You can follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Imagine that. And until then, a couple of things coming up. Let me just tease this. Rob Staten is going to be joining me in the next couple of weeks. Kenneth Arthur of Seaside Joe is going to be joining me in the next couple of weeks as well. And anytime there's breaking news or anything that needs to be reacted to, you know where to find me. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and you'll never miss out on notifications. Until next time, thanks again for listening. I'm Dan.